Oprah Winfrey built one of the most recognized lives in American history, but the story she thought she knew about herself was wrong. When DNA testing traced her ancestry across 3 continents, it did not just fill in missing names. It exposed a lineage connected to African royalty, a specific ethnic group with a surviving culture, and a genetic surprise that challenged everything she had publicly claimed about who she was. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. Oprah Winfrey did not arrive at her Zulu identity quietly. She claimed it publicly, repeatedly, and with genuine conviction. In interviews and on her television platform, she described feeling a deep spiritual and cultural connection to South Africa and its people. She visited the country multiple times, forged a celebrated friendship with Nelson Mandela, and in 2007 opened the Oprah Winfrey Leadership Academy for Girls outside Johannesburg. For Oprah, South Africa was not simply a place she admired. It felt like a place she came from. That belief was not unusual. For African Americans, questions of ancestral origin carry a particular and painful weight that most other communities do not share. The transatlantic slave trade did not merely transport people across an ocean. It systematically destroyed the records, languages, Kpelle, and kinship structures that would have allowed descendants to know where they came from. Enslaved people were renamed, families were separated, and origins were erased as a deliberate feature of the system. The result, centuries later, is a community of tens of millions of people carrying no traceable connection to a specific African homeland. In the absence of documentation, African Americans have long filled that gap with feeling, cultural affinity, and the occasional physical resemblance to people from a particular region. Oprah's connection to the Zulu was built on exactly this foundation. She looked at their culture, their strength, their history, and she recognized something she believed was hers. The problem was that belief, however sincerely held, is not evidence. And in 2006, a documentary project was about to apply a different standard entirely. For the first time, the tools existed to move beyond assumption and cultural feeling and look directly at the biological record she carried in her own cells. What researchers found would not simply add detail to the story Oprah had been telling. It would replace one of its central claims with something more precise, more surprising, and more historically significant than anything she had imagined. The identity she had claimed publicly for years was about to be tested against the only evidence that could not be argued with. Henry Louis Gates Jr. had spent decades thinking about what slavery had taken from Black Americans. As a Harvard professor and one of the country's most prominent literary scholars, he had written extensively about identity, race, and the deliberate erasure of African American history. In 2006, he turned that intellectual preoccupation into a documentary series called African American Lives, built around a single driving question: could modern genealogy and DNA science recover what centuries of slavery had destroyed? The project worked on 2 tracks simultaneously. The first was traditional genealogical research, combing through census records, plantation documents, Freedmen's Bureau files, and courthouse archives to reconstruct family lines as far back as the paper trail would allow. The second was genetic testing, using DNA analysis to reach beyond the point where documents ran out. Together, Gates believed, the 2 methods could give subjects something slavery had deliberately taken from them: an origin, a place, a name for the people they came from. Oprah was among the subjects Gates selected. Her inclusion carried obvious symbolic weight. She was among the most recognized figures in American public life, and she had spoken openly about her ancestral beliefs for years. But her significance to the project went beyond celebrity. She represented something larger: the millions of African Americans who had filled the genealogical silence left by slavery with cultural feeling rather than documented fact. If science could reach her origins, it could demonstrate what was now possible for an entire community. Researchers began building her family tree from the present backward. Living relatives were interviewed. Public records were cross-referenced. Each generation pushed the timeline further into the past, recovering names and places that had gone undocumented for over a century. The work was painstaking. and for a time it was producing results. Then it stopped, not because the researchers had made an error, but because they had reached the boundary that every African American genealogical investigation eventually hits. Beyond a certain point, the records did not thin out gradually. They vanished entirely. What lay on the other side of that wall could not be reached by any document that had survived. The paper trail for Oprah Winfrey's maternal line began in Mississippi. Researchers worked backward through census records, tracing her mother's family through the generations that followed emancipation. Names emerged, dates attached to them, places took shape. For a time, the record held. The earliest named ancestor they could reach was a woman born into slavery in the American South. Her first name survived. Her last name did not, because enslaved people were not recorded by surname in the documents that governed their lives. They appeared in plantation inventories and estate records as property listed by age, gender, and approximate value, sometimes by a given name, more often by none at all. The legal and administrative machinery of slavery had no interest in preserving the identities of the people it controlled. That was not an oversight. It was the architecture of the system. Researchers attempting to reconstruct Black American family lines before 1870 face a specific and consistent problem. That year marked the first federal census in which formerly enslaved people were recorded as individuals with full names. Everything before it exists in fragments. The Freedmen's Bureau, established after the Civil War, generated records of marriages, labor contracts, and family searches that have proven invaluable to genealogists. But those records only reach so far. They document the years immediately following emancipation. They do not reach back into the generations before it. For Oprah's maternal line, the paper trail ended at that boundary. The woman at the beginning of the documented record had a name, but the woman before her did not. And the woman before that existed only as a biological fact, an ancestor whose presence could be inferred, but whose identity had been completely and permanently erased. This was the wall, not a gap that better research could bridge, or an archive that had not yet been located. The records that would have preserved those identities were never created, or were destroyed, or were never meant to exist. The documentary method had reached its limit. What happened next would depend entirely on what the DNA could find, where the documents had failed. When the documentary record fails, science offers a different kind of archive. The human body carries its own history, encoded in DNA that passes from parent to child across generations without the intervention of courts, clerks, or slaveholders. It cannot be confiscated, renamed, or destroyed, and by 2006, the tools to read it had become precise enough to answer questions that no surviving document could touch. The specific tool applied to Oprah's maternal line was mitochondrial DNA testing, known as mtDNA. Unlike the genetic material found in the nucleus of most cells, mitochondrial DNA is inherited exclusively through the mother. A child receives it from their mother, who received it from hers, stretching back in an unbroken maternal chain through every generation. It does not blend with the father's DNA. It does not recombine or shuffle between generations. It passes intact, making it one of the most reliable instruments available for tracing a direct maternal line across centuries. What mitochondrial DNA cannot do is name individuals. It identifies populations, not people. It can point to a geographic region and an ethnic group with a high degree of scientific confidence, but the specific woman who carried it, her name, her face, the details of her life remain beyond its reach. For the purposes of the investigation into Oprah's ancestry, that limitation was accepted. The question was not the name of a specific ancestor. The question was where her maternal line originated and whether the Zulu connection she had long claimed would survive contact with the evidence. The researchers sequenced Oprah's mitochondrial DNA and began comparing it against a global database of known haplogroups, the population clusters identified by shared genetic markers. Each haplogroup carries a signature that links it to a specific ancestral population and geographic origin. The analysis was methodical, the criteria were established, and the comparison was straightforward. Either Oprah's maternal line traced to Southern Africa, where the Zulu people had lived for centuries, or it traced somewhere else entirely. The result was waiting in the data, and it pointed in a direction no one had anticipated. The mitochondrial DNA did not trace to Southern Africa. It traced to West Africa, to a specific ethnic group living in the region that today forms parts of Liberia and Guinea. The people were called the Kpelle. They were not a lost or obscure population. They were, and remain, one of the largest ethnic groups in Liberia, with a surviving language, a documented history, and a culture that has persisted through centuries of disruption, including the very slave trade that carried Oprah's ancestor across the Atlantic. The result was unambiguous. Oprah's direct maternal line did not connect her to the Zulu of South Africa. It connected her to the Kpelle of West Africa, the identity she had claimed publicly for years. The cultural affinity she had described as something felt rather than proven was not supported by the biological record in her own cells. The Zulu connection was not a lie. It was a wish, and science had replaced it with something more precise. For Oprah, the revelation was documented as one of the most emotional moments of the entire African American Live series. She had not expected the Zulu claim to be challenged. She had expected, if anything, confirmation. What she received instead was a correction that came with its own kind of gift, not the identity she had assumed, but a specific, traceable, living one she had never considered. The Kpelle were part of the Manda-speaking peoples of West Africa. Before the slave trade reshaped the region, they inhabited the forest zones of what is now Liberia and Guinea, building communities organized around agriculture, ironworking, and complex social structures. They were not a peripheral group accidentally caught in the machinery of the slave trade. They were among the populations most directly targeted by it. The coastal geography of their homeland placed them within reach of the trade routes that fed the Middle Passage. Oprah's ancestor had traveled one of those routes. The DNA confirmed it. The Zulu chapter of her story was closed, but her ancestry, it turned out, was far from fully told. Mitochondrial DNA traces one line. It follows the mother's mother's mother in an unbroken chain, which means it captures only a single thread of a person's full ancestral fabric. To see the broader picture, researchers turn to a second form of genetic analysis. Autosomal DNA testing examines contributions from all ancestral lines simultaneously, drawing on genetic material inherited from both parents and all four grandparents, reaching back across multiple generations at once. Where mitochondrial DNA gives a single answer, autosomal testing gives a composition. Oprah's autosomal results told a more complicated story than her maternal line alone had suggested. The majority of her ancestry, approximately 89%, traced to sub-Saharan Africa. That finding was consistent with what the mitochondrial result had already indicated and with what researchers had expected, but the remaining percentage carried information that no one had predicted and that the paper trail had never hinted at. A portion of her ancestry traced to Native American populations. The precise percentage was small, but its presence was genetically confirmed and historically unexplained. No document in the genealogical record accounted for it. No family story had preserved it. It had survived only in her DNA, a quiet inheritance from an ancestor whose identity and circumstances remain completely unknown. A further portion traced to European ancestry. This finding was less surprising in isolation. An estimated 35% of African Americans carry detectable European DNA, and the origins of that genetic material are not difficult to trace historically. The plantation system created conditions in which enslaved women had no legal protection from the men who owned them. The European DNA that runs through African American family trees is, in the overwhelming majority of cases, the genetic record of that history. It was not passed down through willing unions. It was imposed. For Oprah, the European component pointed toward a specific lineage. The Winfrey surname itself offered a place to begin. Her paternal ancestors had been enslaved by a white family named Winfrey in Mississippi. and the records that survived from that period suggested a history that the genetic evidence now quietly corroborated. The full shape of her ancestry was becoming visible, and none of it resembled the story she had started with. The Kpelle finding did not simply replace one ancestral label with another. It opened a door into a specific historical world that Oprah had never known she was connected to. Understanding what that connection meant required looking more closely at who the Kpelle were, where they came from, and what happened to them during the centuries when the transatlantic slave trade was at its height. The Kpelle people had lived in the present-day forest zones of Liberia and Guinea for centuries before European contact. They were farmers, iron workers, and traders, organized into communities governed by complex social and spiritual structures. Their homeland sat in a region that became one of the most heavily targeted areas of the West African coast during the era of the slave trade. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, millions of people were taken from that stretch of coastline and loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. The Kpelle were among them. The trade routes that connected West Africa to the American South are not abstract historical geography. They are the physical path that Oprah's ancestor traveled. The mitochondrial DNA result made that journey traceable in a way that no document had ever made possible. Her ancestor had not simply come from Africa in the general sense that all African Americans share. She had come from a specific place, belonging to a specific people, whose descendants still live in that same region today. That specificity carries a meaning that extends beyond Oprah's personal story. For generations, African Americans have referred to a collective ancestral homeland in terms that are necessarily vague: Africa, West Africa, the continent. DNA genealogy has begun to replace that vagueness with precision, offering individuals a named people and a traceable geography in place of a generalized origin. The Kpelle connection gave Oprah exactly that: not a continent, a community, not a feeling, a finding. What remained was the question of what to do with the parts of her ancestry that science had confirmed but history had never recorded. The European and Native American components still carried unanswered questions. One of them pointed toward a history that was considerably darker than anything the Kpelle connection had raised. The European ancestry in Oprah's DNA did not arrive without context. The Winfrey surname itself was an inheritance of enslavement, a name taken from the white family who had owned her paternal ancestors in Mississippi. Genealogical research into that line identified the white Winfrey family as slaveholders in Hinds County, and the records that survived from that household told the story that the DNA was now corroborating in genetic terms. The European component in Oprah's autosomal results was consistent with what researchers find across African American family trees, with a regularity that reflects not ancestry by choice, but ancestry by force. The plantation system operated for generations under conditions in which enslaved women had no legal recourse, no protection, and no standing to refuse. The children born from those circumstances were enslaved at birth, their parentage unacknowledged in any official record, their origins absorbed silently into the genealogical fabric of Black America. The European DNA that appears in Oprah's results is the biological trace of that history. It does not represent a family connection in any conventional sense. It represents what was done. The Native American component remains the least resolved element of her genetic profile. Its presence is confirmed. Its origin is not. No document has surfaced to explain which ancestral line carried it, under what circumstances, or from which specific population it derived. It exists in her DNA as a confirmed fact without a recoverable story, a reminder that genetic evidence can establish presence without establishing meaning. What the full picture of Oprah's ancestry reveals, taken together, is not simply a personal genealogy. It is a compressed map of American history, West African origins, the Middle Passage, the plantation system, the violence embedded in that system, and the encounters between populations that American mythology has consistently preferred to obscure. It is all present, encoded in her cells, confirmed by science, and connected directly to the woman she had always believed herself to be. She thought she was Zulu, The evidence said otherwise, and what the evidence gave her instead was more specific, more truthful, and more historically significant than the identity she had carried for years. Oprah Winfrey's ancestry is not a single story. It is the compressed history of the African American experience, rooted in West Africa, fractured by the Middle Passage, shaped by the violence and survival of slavery, and carrying the genetic imprint of a continent that tried to forget and a country that tried to erase. The Zulu identity she once claimed was replaced by something more specific and more powerful, a living people, a traceable origin. The woman who began that line remains nameless. Perhaps she always will.